Welcome to our deep dive today. It's going to be a fascinating one.
Yeah.
We're going deep into 17th century French philosophy with Nicolas Malebranche.
Oh, great choice.
You know, for a priest, he had some wild ideas,
Yet.
especially about how we see the world around us. It's like, forget everything you think you know about perception, because Malebranche is going to turn it upside down.
That's a great way to put it. Malebranche was a deeply religious thinker, but he was also profoundly influenced by Descartes.
Yeah.
That combination led to some truly unique and challenging ideas, especially his famous doctrine of the vision in God.
Right, the vision in God. I was reading through your notes and you actually highlighted that term.
It's a big one.
It seems like a pretty radical concept. So explain it to me like I'm a philosopher
Okay.
who's been wrestling with epistemology for centuries. No dumbed-down analogies, just the hardcore philosophical meat of it.
I like that challenge. Okay, so imagine this. You're looking at a tree. Seems simple enough, right? But Malebranche says you're not actually seeing the tree directly. Instead, what you're perceiving is God's idea of that tree. Your mind is not directly interacting with the material world, but with God's mind, which contains the perfect representations of all things.
Whoa, hold on a minute. So you're saying that when I see a tree, I'm not seeing the actual physical tree, but God's mental representation of it. What happened to the real world out there?
That's precisely the point. For Malebranche, the material world exists, but we don't have direct access to it. Our knowledge of the world is mediated through God's ideas. Think of God's mind as the ultimate, perfect blueprint of reality.
Yeah.
When we perceive something, we're essentially tapping into that blueprint.
Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around this.
Yeah.
But if our minds only interact with God's ideas, how do we know the material world even exists? It sounds a bit like we're trapped in a divine simulation or something.
Yeah. That's a great question, and one that Malebranche's critics raised as well. He argues that God wouldn't deceive us. Our perceptions, while mediated through his ideas, are still reliable because God guarantees their truthfulness. Plus, Malebranche says we have a clear and distinct idea of extension, the essence of matter, and this idea must come from somewhere. It can't originate in our finite minds.
So we have this clear and distinct idea of extension because God put it there. It's almost like he's ensuring we have a foundation for understanding the physical world, even though we can't experience it directly.
That's a really insightful way to put it. You're starting to see how Malebranche weaves together his philosophical and theological commitments.
He's a Cartesian in that he believes in clear and distinct ideas, but he takes it a step further by grounding those ideas in God's mind. That's where intelligible extension comes in, the ultimate archetype of all material things. Okay, I think I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. But this all raises some pretty big questions about causality. If we're only interacting with God's mind, what's actually causing our experiences? Is it our minds somehow activating God's ideas? Or is God directly causing those perceptions in us?
That's where things get even more interesting. Malebranche develops a concept called efficacious ideas to explain how this all works.
Efficacious ideas. Okay, let's unpack that a bit. This is getting into some heavy metaphysical territory.
Absolutely. So for Malebranche, God's ideas aren't just passive representations. They have a kind of causal power. It's through these efficacious ideas that God produces our perceptions, both sensory and intellectual. So when you see that tree, it's not just that you're accessing God's idea of a tree. God's idea is actively causing your perception of it.
Wow. So God is not only the architect of reality, but he's also the stage manager, constantly orchestrating our every experience.
That's a great way to think about it. It leads us to one of Malebranche's most controversial ideas: occasionalism.
Occasionalism. I knew that was coming. This is where things start to get really wild, right? I mean, we're talking about God being the ultimate puppet master.
Exactly. But to really understand occasionalism, we need to dive deeper into Malebranche's metaphysics and his understanding of causation. Welcome back to our deep dive into the mind of Nicolas Malebranche. When we left off, we were about to tackle the mind-bending concept of occasionalism.
Right, occasionalism. This is where Malebranche really goes all in on God's power and control over everything. It's a radical idea.
Yeah.
But if we're going to understand Malebranche, we have to grapple with it. So no more beating around the bush. Let's get right to the heart of it.
I agree. So to put it simply, occasionalism is the idea that God is the only true cause in the universe. Everything else, including our own actions and choices, are merely occasions for God to act.
Okay, so when I decide to lift my arm, it's not actually my will that's causing the action. It's God using my decision as an occasion to make my arm move.
Exactly. Malebranche argues that created things, whether they're minds or bodies, don't possess any inherent causal power. They can't bring about changes on their own. God is the one who sustains and governs everything, constantly willing everything that happens.
Hold on, so you're saying that even my thoughts and feelings are caused by God. It's starting to feel a bit like I'm just a puppet, with God pulling all the strings.
I understand why you'd say that, but Malebranche wouldn't agree with the puppet analogy. He'd say that God is not manipulating us against our will. Our desires and choices are still real, but they're not the ultimate cause of our actions. They're more like the blueprint that God uses to determine his actions.
Okay, but this raises all sorts of questions about free will and moral responsibility. If God is the one causing everything, how can we be held accountable for our actions? And what does it even mean to make a free choice, if it's ultimately God who's deciding?
These are tough questions, and Malebranche doesn't shy away from them. His answer is subtle and complex, but it centers on the idea of consent.
Consent, like I'm consenting to God controlling my every move. I'm not sure that's much better than being a puppet.
It's not about consciously giving permission to God. Malebranche is getting at a deeper level of volition here. He's saying that while God might present us with certain inclinations or impulses, we still have the freedom to consent to them or resist them. It's in that act of consent, that inner affirmation or denial, where our true agency lies.
So God might give me the inclination to, say, eat that piece of cake, but I can still choose whether to give into that inclination or exercise some self-control.
Precisely. God provides the raw material of our volitions, but we have the power to shape them, to turn them into choices that are truly our own. It's a kind of limited freedom, to be sure, but it's enough, according to Malebranche, to ground moral responsibility.
Okay, I see what he's getting at. But wouldn't a critic say that this consent is still just another occasion for God to act? I mean, if God is the one who ultimately determines whether we consent or not, are we really free in any meaningful sense?
That's a fair point. Malebranche's account of free will is one of the most debated aspects of his philosophy. Some argue that it doesn't truly escape the deterministic implications of occasionalism. Others contend that he offers a nuanced and sophisticated view that preserves a genuine sense of agency within the framework of God's omnipotence.
It's definitely a head-scratcher. I can see why philosophers are still arguing about this centuries later. But let's move on to another tricky issue that occasionalism raises, the problem of evil. If God is the cause of everything, how do we explain the existence of suffering and wrongdoing in the world?
Malebranche addresses the problem of evil head-on. He starts by emphasizing that God doesn't will evil directly. God's will is always directed towards the good. But evil can arise as an unintended consequence of the way the world is ordered. He uses an analogy of a skilled craftsman. A craftsman might create a perfectly functioning machine, but there will always be some friction or heat generated as a byproduct of its operation. Similarly, the laws that govern the universe, while ultimately good and wise, can sometimes lead to suffering or harm.
So you're saying that evil is like a side effect of God's good creation. It's a result of the necessary limitations of a finite world.
Exactly. Malebranche argues that God prioritizes order and simplicity in his creation. He establishes general laws that govern the universe rather than constantly intervening with particular volitions. This allows for a stable and predictable world that we can understand through reason and science, but it also means that some bad things will inevitably happen.
I see. But doesn't that make God seem a bit cold and detached? Like he's more concerned with the overall elegance of his creation than with the suffering of individual creatures.
That was a common criticism leveled at Malebranche's theodicy. Critics argued that his view made God seem indifferent to the plight of individuals, too focused on the grand scheme of things. They pointed out that if God truly cared about our well-being, he wouldn't allow so much suffering to occur.
It's a tough argument to counter. Malebranche's emphasis on God's general will might explain the order and regularity of the universe, but it doesn't seem to offer much comfort to those who are experiencing pain or loss. But let's shift gears a bit. I'm also curious about what all of this means for how we should live our lives. If God is the ultimate cause of everything, does that mean we're off the hook when it comes to morality?
Not at all. In fact, Malebranche's philosophy leads to a very specific and demanding ethical vision. He argues that the key to living a good life is to align our will with God's will, to love what God loves, and to desire what he desires.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we know what God loves and desires?
That's where our vision in God comes in. Remember, for Malebranche, we have access to God's mind, to the eternal truths and perfections that reside there. Through careful contemplation and reflection, we can come to understand God's nature and his will for us.
So morality is about attuning ourselves to God's perfect ideas.
Exactly. Malebranche emphasizes the importance of clear and distinct ideas, not just for knowledge, but for ethics as well. He argues that we can only truly love and desire what we clearly understand. So if we want to live a good life, we need to cultivate clear and distinct ideas of what is truly good and valuable.
And where do we find those clear and distinct ideas? You guessed it.
In the mind of God.
This is all starting to connect. But wouldn't a critic argue that Malebranche's ethics reduces to a kind of blind obedience to God's will? Where's the room for individual autonomy or moral reasoning?
That's a good question, and it gets to the heart of Malebranche's view of the relationship between faith and reason.
So we spent a lot of time unpacking these really dense ideas, but I think it's worth it because, Malebranche's philosophy is so rich and so challenging.
It is.
It really does make you question everything you thought you knew about,
Yeah,
perception, causation, free will, the whole shebang.
absolutely.
But before we wrap up, I'm kind of curious about how his ideas were received by his contemporaries. Like, what kind of impact did he have on the history of philosophy? Was he kind of a lone wolf, or did his work actually influence other thinkers?
Well, Malebranche was definitely a controversial figure in his own time.
I can imagine.
His ideas about vision in God and occasionalism and the role of God in human life really sparked some heated debates among philosophers and theologians.
Yeah.
But even his critics had to acknowledge the brilliance and originality of his work.
I can imagine his philosophy is so unique and challenging. It's like he took Cartesianism and turned it up to 11, infusing it with this intense religious fervor.
That's a good way to put it. And while some dismissed him as a mystic or a religious fanatic, others recognized the profound implications of his thought. In fact, Malebranche's influence can be traced through the history of modern philosophy, even in thinkers who disagreed with him.
Really? So who are some of the philosophers who were influenced by Malebranche?
Well, one of the most notable is George Berkeley, the Irish philosopher who is famous for his idealist philosophy.
Wait, Berkeley, the to be is to be perceived guy?
Exactly. Berkeley took Malebranche's idea of mediating perception through God's ideas and radicalized it. He argued that there is no material world at all, only minds and ideas. Everything that exists is either a mind perceiving or an idea being perceived.
Wow. That's taking things even further than Malebranche.
Yeah.
So in a way, Berkeley was pushing Malebranche's vision in God to its logical conclusion.
You could say that. Berkeley saw the problems with the Cartesian notion of material substance that exists independently of minds, and he used Malebranche's arguments about perception to dismantle it.
So even though Malebranche wasn't trying to be an idealist, his work helped pave the way for Berkeley's radical idealism.
Absolutely. And Berkeley wasn't the only one. David Hume, the Scottish skeptic, was also deeply influenced by Malebranche.
Hume, the guy who doubted everything.
Yeah.
I'm surprised to hear that he was interested in Malebranche. They seem like they'd be on totally different wavelengths.
It might seem that way, but Hume actually saw Malebranche as a kindred spirit in some ways. He was fascinated by Malebranche's arguments about causation. You know, how we never directly observe causal connections between events.
Right. Malebranche believed that it's God who's doing all the causing, not the things themselves.
Yeah.
So Hume took that idea and ran with it, developing his own skeptical account of causation.
Exactly. Hume argued that we never experience cause and effect, only a constant conjunction of events. We infer a causal connection based on habit and custom, but there's no necessary link between cause and effect that we can observe directly.
Oh, that's classic Hume, always questioning our assumptions about the world. It's amazing to think that Malebranche, this deeply religious thinker, had such a profound influence on the development of modern skepticism.
It's a testament to the power and originality of his ideas. Malebranche forced philosophers to confront fundamental questions about knowledge, causation, and the nature of reality, questions that continue to be debated today.
So even though he might not be as famous as Descartes or Locke, Malebranche's legacy lives on in the ongoing philosophical conversations he inspired.
Absolutely. He's a key figure in the history of modern philosophy, and his work continues to challenge and provoke us, even centuries later.
Well, I have to say, this deep dive into Malebranche has been a wild ride. It's definitely stretched my brain in all sorts of ways. What stands out to you as his most important contributions to philosophy?
I think Malebranche's greatest legacy is his radical rethinking of the relationship between a God, mind, and world. He challenged the prevailing assumptions of his time, pushing the boundaries of philosophical and theological inquiry. Whether you agree with him or not, his ideas are impossible to ignore. They force us to grapple with fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the limits of human knowledge, and the source of meaning and value in our lives.
Yeah. That's a great way to sum it up. He's a philosopher who truly makes you think differently about everything. So, for anyone out there who's looking for a philosophical adventure, I highly recommend diving into the world of Nicolas Malebranche. You might not agree with everything he says,
Yeah,
but I guarantee it'll be a thought-provoking journey.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the mind of Nicolas Malebranche. We'll see you next time, ready to explore another fascinating corner of the world of ideas.